Welcome. I'm Scott Converse with the Longmont Observer, the publisher, and today we have with us Mike Foote.
Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And as I understand it, and one of the reasons we're talking today is that there is an opening in the Colorado Senate.
That's right. Yeah, it's a bit unusual. I mean, most people think that the 2018 elections are over, and here we are, just trying to fill out the elections and complete it. It's a vacancy process now because most people in Boulder County probably know that Senator Matt Jones won the county commissioner seat in Boulder County. So he had 2 years left in the Senate District 17 spot, and so that needs to be filled by somebody. And so a vacancy committee will be called, and the vacancy committee in this case is made up of mostly precinct leaders within Senate District 17, so Democratic precinct leaders within Senate District 17, and area coordinators, people that have been active and involved in helping to elect Democrats, will make up the vacancy committee. It's about 175 people or so will be eligible to vote, and maybe all of them will show up, maybe it'll be a few less than that, but those are the folks that will determine who ends up filling out the final 2 years of Matt Jones's Senate seat term.
So how many people are actually then doing the voting?
Well, there's 175 people that are eligible.
And really? So it's every single person on this?
On the vacancy committee.
Okay.
But not everybody is going to show up. Some folks may have a conflict or something like that. But so give or take, we might see somewhere between 130 and 150 people show up and have a vote in this.
And this is made up of county Democrats or area Democrats that are specific to this seat? Right,
yeah. It's those that are in Senate District 17. So roughly that is Louisville, Lafayette, the Boulder County part of Erie, and Longmont. And precinct leaders for the Boulder County Democrats that are in that particular Senate district.
All right, fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we know are important to our voters here. So one of the things that the Republicans, for instance, are pointing out a lot is now that the Democrats have pretty firm control, I would say, of the state, that they're saying we're going to overreach. The Democrats are going to overreach, and that's a fear. So what's the deal there?
Well, everybody has a different opinion about that, of course, and often that's what you hear from the party that's in the minority, is they want to talk about overreach. And I think, well, first of all, I think that efforts should always be made to bring in the minority party and try to achieve consensus and bipartisan agreement on things that we do. I mean, that should be something that we always try to do. We shouldn't just ignore it just because we're in the majority. And I should mention also that in the state Senate, there's a 2-seat majority for Democrats. So it's not
a real tight one.
It's not one seat that's really tight, but it's
pretty tight.
It's fairly tight. I mean, they just have to peel off 2 Democrats to defeat a bill, which it can be possible in some cases. So certainly I think you could get bills through on just a party line vote, and I'm sure there will be some that will get through on a party line vote, but I think we should do our best to try to achieve consensus on as many bills as possible. Now, having said that, I go back to the last time that we had a trifecta, which was 2013, 2014. In the state legislature, we had a majority in the Senate, majority in the House, and then Governor Hickenlooper, a Democrat, as governor. And we passed a lot of bills, really good bills. Many of them, I think it was about 90-some%, had bipartisan support. The ones that didn't have bipartisan support, though, are the ones that people heard about. But you look back at those bills, and I think many of those were very good policy. I'll mention just a couple of them. The bill that created the all-mail ballot system came in 2013, and that was a bill that we heard all kinds of protests from Republicans, particularly the Secretary of State, Scott Gessler at the time, about how it was not workable, how it would lead to massive fraud, and all of these things. And if I remember correctly, that passed on a party line vote. It was all Democrats voted for it and Republicans voted against it. I may be off 1 or 2, but that's pretty much what it was. And that's turned out to be a wonderful system, despite the protests and the doomsday predictions that we heard from the minority party at the time. And so, in fact, it's led to Colorado being one of the top 3 states in voter participation every year since then. This last year, I think People probably know that this congressional district is one of the top 2 in the country for voter participation, and CD2, I should say rather, CD4 was one of the top 5. So 2 of the top 5 in Colorado on voter participation, I think, are as a result of the mail-in ballot. So that passed, even though there was a lot of Republican opposition, but we passed it through anyway. It was a good bill. Another one I'll point towards was the renewable energy bill that we passed in 2013. And it seems like the memory has faded a little bit since then. It's been a couple of years, but that was a bill that created a renewable energy standard, a mandate for rural electrics to meet by, I think it was the early 2020s. And it wasn't as high as Excel has to meet, but it was something that was higher than what the rural electrics had to meet anyway. That bill was so hotly contested. You heard again the minority party talking about how it was going to lead to some kind of doomsday and how rural electrics were going to have to raise their rates and all kinds of terrible things about how it was unworkable. You may recall that the so-called war on rural Colorado came up during that time, and it was pushed through radio ads and all kinds of different media on the conservative end. And we passed it. I'm fairly certain that we passed it on a party line vote. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, the rural electrics are coming back saying, oh yeah, we're going to be able to meet this standard. And in fact, the renewable energy that we have on the grid now is going to be cheaper than coal and natural gas. So it turned out to be good. And we passed a couple of other things like Medicaid expansion, driver's licenses for undocumented. These were good policies, and I don't regret us passing those at all. But each time we passed something like that, it led to a claim of overreach. We also passed gun safety bills during that time, and that was very controversial. I think most people remember that. Ultimately, we had a couple of recalls as a result of that, although I would argue it wasn't because of the policy, it was because of our lack of communication and just being caught flat-footed and against the opposition. So, for example, on those gun bills in particular, after the 2013 session, I went around and did some door knocking and in the district, and one of the main questions that I had for people was, well, what do you think about what we did in the 2013 session? And in particular, what did you think about the gun bills that we passed? What a lot of people said was, well, you're trying to take away our guns, or it's gun control, the types of things that we heard from the opposition. That was the high-level impression that they had. But then when I went back and asked them about the specific bills that we passed, what do you think about background checks for gun purchases? And most people would say, oh, I think that's a good idea. In fact, it has 85, 90% approval rating, which nothing ever has nowadays, but that particular policy does. And then I asked, well, another bill that we passed dealt with domestic violence offenders having their weapons taken away temporarily during the course of the case, because research shows that that's one of the most dangerous times in a relationship is after the one person has been charged with domestic violence and the other partner is at high risk of being injured or killed by a weapon. And so most people found that to be reasonable as well. We got to the magazine limitation, and that's where it really split 50-50 as far as people thinking that was a good idea or a bad idea. But my point is that when you took those gun bills into smaller chunks, what do you think about this policy? What do you think about that policy? Most people that I spoke with seemed to think the individual policies were sound. It was just the overall impression that Democrats were pushing through this agenda that was supposed to lead to taking away people's guns, and that was just a communication failure, I think, on our part. So I guess I'm meandering a little bit on the question, but the bottom line to me is something that we learned, I think, in 2013 and to a lesser extent 2014, which is that we should work on passing policies that we think are good policies. They're good for Coloradans. Many of these are policies that we ran on and Democrats won on, and we shouldn't be afraid to push those through. We need to be better, though, in making sure that we address the attacks on those policies and address the communications aspect of it, just to make sure that there's not this overall perception that we fell victim to, I think, in 2013 and 2014. So many things that we did during those years turned out to be very good policies. It's just that I think that we were more focused, as we should have been, on policy and maybe a little bit less prepared about how to address the communications outside of the Capitol.
All right. Speaking of things that can be kind of controversial, let's talk a little bit about healthcare. Paulus has our new governor has basically talked about Medicare for all. Really, that's kind of what he's talked about. What's your position on that, and what can we do with the state and where we're at today?
Well, of course, our governor-elect has made it pretty clear that he wants to address healthcare in a lot of different ways. And our lieutenant governor incoming, Diane Primavera, we worked together in the legislature. We overlapped, I think, for 4 years there. And so I know that she's very focused on healthcare and very focused on patients and patients' rights. So I'm sure that she'll be in the middle of it as well. I think there's a lot of things that we can do in the area. One thing that I focused on, particularly last year, was healthcare price transparency. And I did that for a few reasons. Number one, it was something that a constituent group here within the House district had really started to champion. And so I wanted to bring a bill as well to champion this idea. It does a couple of things. Of course, it allows people to know what the price is ahead of time for their healthcare service, which a lot of times we don't know. And suddenly it leads to $5,000 bills because you went to the urgent care when you had no idea you were going to get a bill for that. So, of course, from a consumer perspective, price transparency is a good thing. But also, I think that across the board, healthcare price transparency will lead to a reduction in the increases in healthcare. In other words, it won't go up as fast, I think. It'll make it more of a realistic system, just like anything else. If you go to the grocery store, you know what the price is going to be, so the grocery store can't just have some outrageous price on a head of lettuce, because people are going to know that. That system doesn't exist here in healthcare. You can have one hospital that'll charge an outrageous price for a procedure, whereas the hospital down the road may charge a much less outrageous price for the procedure, and nobody knows that. So nobody really can make a decision like you can for everything else, any kind of consumer good, any kind of a service. You have the prices ahead of time. So I think it helps consumers, of course, be able to make good choices. Now, they may not decide just totally based on the price, and everyone understands that, but that information is not available now, and I think we need to make sure that it is available. But also, I think it helps change the market in a way that makes it more rational, so that you can't have these providers that, or you could, but providers may not do it nearly as much, charging these outrageous prices for the same kind of service that someone down the street charges for. So that's one thing that I want to continue working on. Last year, it was a very big bill. It was a heavy lift. We didn't get it through last year, and that's okay. That's fairly typical for big bills that would create changes like that. But I think with lessons learned going forward, we can put something like that into place. And that's not the only thing that could be done on healthcare, of course. I'm sure our incoming governor has a lot of other things in mind, but I know it's a focus of his, as well as the lieutenant governor, as it should be, because so many folks are having issues with the increasing price of healthcare. It just keeps going and going and going through the roof, and we can do some things here in Colorado, and we should be.
What about, how do you sync that up with what happens at the federal level with healthcare?
Well, it's not easy, of course, but I mean, each state has an ability to make policy changes that just focus on folks in the state. You know, we have a division of insurance, of course, that oversees insurance just here that's specific to Colorado. And we have a number of mechanisms here that are just specific to Colorado. So I think that we can make changes that are specific to Colorado and not necessarily to the country. One example is our Medicaid expansion was specific to Colorado. I mean, that's a state-specific type of healthcare decision. And so the federal Affordable Care Act and the fallout and all of that kind of policy that came from that is one aspect of it, but the feds don't control this 100%. In fact, I think the states have the ability to make positive changes. Now, of course, it'd be so much better if the feds were on board and doing things that were good policy at this point, but that's not the reality we live in here in 2018, and probably not until 2020. But in the meantime, we can do things here, and we should be.
So let's talk a little bit about a real hot topic here in Longmont, which is affordable housing. Right now there's a inclusionary housing ordinance in front of our city council, which is getting a huge amount of attention from the city council as well as the population in general. And it's an issue in general for our area in Colorado. So what kind of things can we do to address the affordable housing issue?
Well, as you mentioned, and it's totally correct, it's an issue for so many families here, not just in Longmont, but all of Boulder County and most of Colorado. And even if you go to places like Durango or Salida, I mean, pretty much across the state we have this issue, but particularly on the Front Range. I think that the affordable housing issue is one that there's a lot of progress that we can make on the local level, and the local city councils know best what's going to match for their community. What may be right for Longmont is not necessarily right for Boulder or for Commerce City or Greeley or wherever. So that's the whole point of our system and local control system. I think we can make it even more of a local control system by taking away some of the prohibitions we have at the state level when it comes to affordable housing. And we should look into some statutes that were passed long ago that dealt with rent control, with requiring a certain number of affordable housing units to be part of a development, those types of statutes. And I'm not saying that we tweak it one way or the other or get rid of it, but I think we should look at those things, because the overall policy in my mind is we should empower local communities to do what they think is appropriate. Even down the road from Longmont to Lafayette, there's going to be different solutions on the table. And what happens sometimes is that you have these interests like the apartment association or others that will go to the state and get the state to pass prohibitions on certain types of actions. And then the state occupies that field, and we see this in oil and gas as well, where it's just the state is the authority. I think in this particular area, we should make sure that the state is not as much of an authority. We should make sure that the local governments have the ability to make those decisions. Now, from the state's perspective, other than making sure local governments have more authority than they do now, I think the state can help with providing tax credits like we have been. Tax credits are very effective. In this area, there's actually a affordable housing project that went up in eastern Longmont over by 9th and Pace that took advantage of some state tax credits. It was just opened, I think, in May. It was just filled in May, and it's a very good development. So I think state's tax credits really are significant. They can help, but also local governments need to be able to have as much flexibility as we can come up with so that they can address the issue at home.
All right. Another issue that is really dear to our hearts here is the oil and gas issue, which you had touched on just a little bit. It is very hot, and we do have drilling outside of Longmont now, but we are still getting drilling underneath, for instance, our reservoir. And this is about to happen in several other areas that you would be responsible for if you got this position. What's your addressing? How do you address this particular issue without pissing off everybody?
Well, I don't know if that's possible. There's going to be people that are upset no matter what, and there's a lot we can talk about. In fact, the oil and gas issue is one of the issues that I really led on in the State House, and I would hope to be able to do in the State Senate as well. And it's one of the main reasons why, I think we're in a unique position that we can actually make some progress on this issue now. And it's one of the main reasons why I think that...
when you say we, you mean the state of Colorado in general?
The state of Colorado, right. And those of us that believe in reforming the system, I should be more specific there. Those of us that believe in reforming the system, I think we're in kind of a unique position right now to be able to make progress that we haven't seen in over a decade, probably longer than that we can make some real substantial changes. Prior to this, we had a governor that was much more friendly to oil and gas. And prior to that, we had another governor that was fairly friendly to oil and gas as well. And now we have an incoming governor that isn't as friendly, I think. And certainly I've worked with Governor-elect Polis on the oil and gas issue, and so I know many of his views on it. And I think that it's going to be a big difference trying to push bills through when you don't have a governor that's trying to make sure the bills don't go anywhere. And that's what happened in the prior administration. We saw that with almost all of our efforts even in 2013 and 2014, when we had the trifecta, we saw folks from the governor's office that were lobbying against the bills that we were trying to pass, local control bills, even an increase in inspectors. We finally passed that through the budget process. But the Department of Natural Resources was lobbying against increased inspectors. And so I don't think we're going to see that now. And I think that's a really good thing. And it's also quite apparent now. In my mind, it was apparent before, but now it's even more apparent that there's many, many Coloradans that think that the system needs to be changed. I mean, we saw Proposition 112 lose 55 to 45. That was the setbacks proposition.
2,500 foot setback.
2,500 feet with no exceptions, and locals could go farther than that. It lost, but it also got over 1.1 million votes in the face of over $40 million of money that we know of that was spent against it. It probably was closer to about 50 million, frankly. So that should tell you something. And it should tell you that there's a lot of Coloradans that, even though the industry was blasting out there that this is going to be a ban, it's going to cause, I don't know, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000, maybe a million jobs it just always went up how many jobs they said were going to be lost as a result of this. Despite all of that and the $40 to $50 million that was spent, still 1.1 million plus Coloradans voted for that measure. So I think what that tells you is there's a lot of people that think that health and safety needs to come first, period, instead of this so-called balance that was being used that really turned out to be drill first and ask questions later. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things we can do on the oil and gas issue at the state level, including making sure that we increase setbacks as a base level for the entire state, including local control, which would mean that Longmont City Council, for example, could address oil and gas development just like they can anything else. If there's a housing development that people want to put in, or a chemical plant, or anything.
So you treat it more like zoning and planning type stuff.
Just like everything else. Yeah. And city councils like Longmont should be able to do that. That's the basis of a couple of bills that I ran that unfortunately didn't succeed. They were well, I'll just say that they didn't succeed. But now I think we have a better shot at getting something like that passed. We need to reform the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. This is a commission that has not denied a permit for drilling, ever. And so we need to make sure that they put safety and health first. The precautionary principle should be first, and not just saying, well, let's just go ahead and drill there because there's minerals there. Health and safety have to come first, so we can do some things in that area. And the other area I think that we should be working on is the severance tax area. While I don't think that we should be having drilling at all, because I believe in making sure that we have all renewables, and I believe in addressing climate change as quickly as possible, to the extent that it does happen, the severance tax that is paid on that is I shouldn't say next to nothing. I mean, it adds up to something, but comparatively speaking, it's a drop in the bucket. And that's because of all the exemptions and the corporate welfare that the oil and gas industry gets, adds up to meaning that the severance tax rate, the effective rate that they pay here in Colorado, is the lowest in the country. It's about 1%. After you take into consideration all of their tax credits and expenditures and everything else. So we should address that too. But I don't think that's as important as the first three, because I think local communities need to have a very meaningful say in what happens in their backyards. Health and safety has to be first. Setbacks have to be increased. And that's really going to be the basis of the legislative agenda I bring, if I'm selected to go into the Senate, to the table this next session.
You touched a little bit on climate change, and Longmont, for instance, has passed ordinances that get us to 100% renewable by 2030.
Right.
Is that something the state should do? Is that where are we at on that?
Yes. Well, and our incoming governor campaigned on that. He talked about 100% by 2040, and he made no secret about the fact that he wanted to go that route. And I'm fully in support of that, if not sooner.
I was going to say, is that soon enough?
Well,
2040?
No. No. If you believe the reports that have just come out about how we really just have basically a decade and a half before irreversible changes occur to our climate. So 2030 may not be quick enough either. I mean, I think we should do it as quickly as possible. 2030 versus 2040, I'm not sure how that comes out. I mean, the renewable energy mandate that was put on Excel back around 2007, 2008, and then the extension of it around that time as well, the voter-approved extension, Excel exceeded before the date anyway. And the bottom line is renewables are cheaper than...
They're good business.
It's the way to go. I mean, it's cheaper. It's of course it's cleaner. It's cheaper. And so if you put all that into play, I'm not sure why we can't do it even sooner than that. And I think that we should be pushing to be as aggressive as possible in this area.
So another area that's important to Longmont is transportation. As you know, RTD is... A lot of people in Longmont feel that we got screwed over by RTD.
Absolutely.
And our mayor has been working this pretty heavily, as our city council has. What can be done to get things equitable again?
In the RTD sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, in transportation
in
general,
transportation.
But RTD specifically, because that's such for us,
right.
a hot topic.
Well, you know, it's pretty clear, I think, to most people that our infrastructure just needs to be addressed. I mean, we have infrastructure that's kind of been stuck in place for the last 25 years, 20 years.
But why is that?
Well, the funding is a problem. I mean, remember we put Tabor in place about 25 years ago.
So it's Tabor.
And so since then, there has not been any kind of an increase in funding from taxpayers. There was groups that tried to put that on the ballot, and it did put it on the ballot this last time, particularly Proposition 110, to increase sales tax in order to pay for more infrastructure. But it failed. It failed 60-40, I think, statewide, so it didn't even come close. But certainly you can't get something for nothing. I mean, if you want to build infrastructure, you have to have the funding for it. We've wrestled with this at the legislature, and one view that comes typically from the Republican Party is that we should just issue bonds and take money to pay for the bonds out of things like Medicaid or education. I've never felt like that's a good approach, and I think most Democrats don't feel like that's a good approach. You have to get the money from somewhere, and so, of course, the sales tax increase that was proposed in 110 didn't succeed. Boulder County, it did pass. I think about 57% voted for it, but that's not nearly as high as we've seen other tax increases pass Boulder County. And in fact, if you want to pass a statewide tax increase of some kind, you have to have Boulder County at well over 70% in order to pass that. So I think a lot of that was because it was a sales tax increase, and sales tax is inherently regressive. And we heard a lot of that actually on the campaign trail and just talking to folks during the course of the campaign. And I have to say I agree with that. I think it is a regressive tax. But proponents always talk about how the sales tax polls better than a gas tax. I haven't seen those polls. I don't know, but it seems to me that it makes more sense to try to push forward a gas tax solution as opposed to a sales tax solution. Now, sales tax has worked at a local level, and of all places, Colorado Springs passed a sales tax increase recently in order to address their infrastructure in their area, or at least partially address it. So I think people go back and forth on that. But another reason why I think that 110 didn't pass, or it passed, but it didn't pass by enough here in Boulder County, was because of the RTD situation. So, as you noted, in 2004, we voted for fast tracks. We voted for the train. And we've been paying tax for a train since 2004, but we've got no train. And it doesn't even look like we're going to get anything in the near future as well. So I think for a lot of folks that were around here during that time and voted for the fast tracks based on the fact that we were going to get a train, they feel a little kind of once bitten, twice shy when it comes to increases for revenue. So what we've tried to tell people and down at the Capitol is we have to address this train situation in RTD. If you're going to get Boulder County on board with another tax increase, you have to address the train situation, because otherwise people are going to keep talking about it. Well, we're paying this tax already for the train and we're not getting the train. And I completely agree. So we just have to keep pushing that forward.
Can that happen at a state level? Can you make RTD do something?
Well, yes and no. I mean, of course we can pass laws, and we can also use the bully pulpit that we have at the state level, and we can provide oversight like we do for anything. So, but RTD has their own independently elected board, of course, and so we can't really, that's difficult for us to overrule. But we have to use every lever that we can in order to try to get the train, and RTD folks have to really recognize that.
So you have been in state government for quite a while, since 2012?
Yeah, I've been elected to the House since 2012.
So tell us a little bit about what you've done and some of your accomplishments, and
Sure.
Why should we have you again as a senator?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I first of all, since 2012, serving the legislature in the House has been a real honor, and I feel very privileged to have been elected by the folks here in Eastern Boulder County to represent them. Learned a lot during that period. Learned a lot about the community, learned a lot about how to make law, how to legislate effectively, and some of it's been some hard-earned expertise. I can't say that everything I've tried has succeeded, but I've learned as much from those setbacks as I have from successes. And as time goes on, like with anything, being in the legislature is like any kind of a job. When you first start, you don't know as much as when you've been doing it for a couple of years. You can't expect somebody to be at that same level. So I feel like there's a fairly steep learning curve, but then you start to kind of hit your stride around the third or fourth year of the legislature, and really able to understand how to get some of these bigger bills passed. I'd say the bills that I'm most proud of since I was down there are the bills that required real creative solutions. One of those was the Crimes Against Pregnant Women Act that I passed, and that was in response to a number of tragedies that unfortunately occurred where a woman lost her pregnancy at a late stage. And of course we've seen that happen in Longmont a couple of times in the last 6 or 7 years. It's been truly tragic whenever it has happened. One was a car accident, and another was that terrible case, the Dynell Lane case. So there was obviously a gap in the criminal code that didn't address these types of issues, and it didn't address assigning appropriate responsibility, criminal responsibility for doing something like this. And that led to a lot of issues, not the least of which were your biannual personhood ballot measures that threatened to basically cut off any access to legal abortion here in Colorado if it would have passed. So something had to be done, but there had been efforts to try to solve the issue for 10 years. When what I was able to do is really thread that needle so that we made sure that we kept in place all of women's reproductive rights, but still addressed the issue of criminal culpability for an unlawful termination of pregnancy. And that was a needle to be thread. And I'm proud of the fact that we were able to do that. And that was, I think, one of the, I consider that to be a real accomplishment down there, to be able to find a new solution and then get people to agree. You have to have your 33 House members, your 18 senators, and the governor agree to that. And in fact, that happened in this case. And there was other examples as well. One that's, I think, pretty relevant to here in Longmont is a bill that I passed with the help of the St. Vrain Valley School District, and that dealt with mental health in the schools. Prior to this bill, if there was a threat that was made against a school that was made known to a mental health provider, the mental health provider could not disclose that to the school except under very limited circumstances, basically an imminent threat to that particular school. Then they could break confidentiality and disclose it. We changed that around so that it could be disclosed under other circumstances as well. It's not the imminent threat, it was more of a significant threat. And the provider could choose then to decide to make that disclosure to the school. And I think that's significant in a number of ways. Of course, we want to make sure that our schools are safe. But also, there is, again, a needle to be thread when it comes to mental health, patient confidentiality, and school safety. And we went back and forth with a number of stakeholders, and we really, I think, found the solution that turned out to be a good solution for everybody involved. And so I was proud of that one as well. There's a number of other examples that I think that we were able to make a difference by coming up with unique solutions to the issue and get your legislators, the other legislators, and the governor to agree. And that's really where I feel like I've been able to earn my keep down the legislature, has been able to come up with these bills and these solutions. And I think that I'll be able to take that kind of expertise and that experience to the Senate if I'm selected to come up with some unique solutions to some of these other problems. For example, climate change, oil and gas, gun safety, the healthcare transparency bill that I mentioned before. These are all big bills, and these are all heavy lifts. I don't think that I would feel nearly as confident in my ability to put a viable proposal forward if it weren't for the fact that I had been down there for 6 years in the House.
So, thank you so much for your time. How do people find out more about you?
Well, I have a website, of course.
I figured you might have a website. I don't know what it is, but
it's just my name. It's MikeFoote.org.
MikeFoote.org.
That's right.
Foote, right?
Right. And it's a bit limited at this point. We're just focused on the vacancy committee, and so it's got some information about some of the bills that I've passed and what I envision if I do make it down to the Senate and selected by the vacancy committee. And so, of course, there's information there. I've maintained a Facebook and Twitter presence since 2011, and I try to post on there personally at least a couple times a day, maybe one time a day. I try to do that. So there's all kinds of information out there, and of course I would invite everybody to take a look at it.
That's what Google is for.
Exactly.
Thank you all for listening and or watching, and I want to
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, and thanks for listening. It's been good to be on the show, and I appreciate everything that you do.
All right, thank you.